much a self-learning process, but it began with going to a doctor's appointment. And the doctor recognized I was more stressed than I should be. Now, he was a holistic physician, right? So he had more tools in his toolbox than many physicians do. And I can't remember why I went to him in the first place, but it was nothing to do with my thoughts or my past or anything. It was like it must have been a physical thing. But he recognized I was stressed. And he asked me on a scale of 0 through 10 what my stress level was. And I told him 8, which was high. I mean, I was a stay-at-home mother at the time. I had 2 healthy young boys, right? It shouldn't have been that stressful. But when I said it was an 8, he asked me why. And that question made me realize, okay, it was finding my mother dead on the bathroom floor when I was 19. And at this point, I was in my late 30s. So that was 2 decades prior, because the tears from that event were still just under the surface all these years later, because I had not dealt with it. I'd kept all that energy inside of me. And he happened to know this technique that's called EFT, which is short for emotional freedom technique. It's also called tapping, because we're tapping on certain places on our body as we're talking something through. So he tapped with me for about 15 minutes about my mother's death. And I walked away from that appointment being able to tell the story of her death in my mind for the first time ever. And that's when I realized we hold all our memories, all our emotions from our past inside of our body, and that we can let them go. So that was the first technique that I used.
Right. Okay. So you started with EFT, but I'm guessing it developed into something more than EFT. Would that be right?
It did. So let me explain a little bit more. So
Yeah.
I went home that day and I learned everything I could about EFT because it was given away by Gary Craig for free. So anyone can learn how to do it. And I have an engineering background. I like to know things are going to work. I don't want to waste my time doing something that doesn't work. So I wanted to check it out. So at the time, I had a 17-year-old cat at home, and his kidneys were starting to fail. And we were told we had to give him a daily injection of saline solution. And the first time I gave him that injection, my hand was shaking so badly. I was so afraid of giving them this shot. So I thought, well, let me try out this technique on something this kind of simple. So I did. So I tapped about every aspect of it, which is something you do with EFT. So I tapped about my hand shaking. I tapped about my fear of hurting my cat. And I tapped about all the memories from all the injections I had had over the years, because I'd had many. And the next day, when I gave him that shot, the needle just slid right in. So all that fear that had been living inside of me the day before had totally disappeared. So that's when I realized how powerful it was. Almost deceptively powerful, because it doesn't look like it's doing much and doesn't necessarily feel like it's doing much. So I think a lot of people overlook it. But that's when I started to use it. So every day I started to notice when I was emotional. When I could notice that, right, which is tricky to begin with, to actually stand back and say, okay, I'm getting frustrated, rather than actually going ahead and being frustrated. So then I would tap. And I would bring myself from frustration back into peace. And I found that I was changing. I was becoming more peaceful on the inside, but I wanted it to go faster. I was impatient to change. So I wrote down every emotional memory I could think of from my childhood. So all the big traumas, all the little traumas, all the humiliations, all the judgments, all the beliefs that I had picked up. And I tapped through one each night for an hour to an hour and a half each night. And that's when things really started to change. And my mind started to become quiet, which I had never experienced before. It felt really odd. In fact, I remember opening my kitchen door one day and saying to myself, it feels like I'm living in a different reality, because it just felt just strange to me. And that's when I realized that all those thoughts, those judgments, those self-criticisms that had been in my mind had been my dad's words and my dad's phrases that I had taken on as my own and just replayed them over and over again. But I couldn't see that until they'd gone. Right? Then I could look back and say, okay, that's what was happening. But as that happened, what I realized EFT is doing, it's opening up the subconscious mind. So the more you tap, the more memories come up, the more of your past opens up to you, which is also the same thing as an expansion of self-awareness. So you become aware of yourself at a deeper level. So the first level was becoming aware of my emotions, which I had kind of been shut off to before. And then underneath that, there's a set of physical sensations. So if you have something like frustration, you're actually holding your body in tension somewhere, maybe in multiple places, but you call that frustration. You say, I'm frustrated when you're experiencing those sensations, but you can become aware of those sensations. And I hadn't known that before. So when I became aware of those sensations, that's when I started to use a different technique, because I had a deeper level of self-awareness.